The report, was it Chase the Report? Chase Podcast? Chaser?
Yeah, Chase the Report podcast.
Chase the Report. Chase the Report podcast, wherever you find the podcast. Charles and Gabby, thanks so much. See you soon.
Thank you.
Stream ABC Radio Sydney live through the ABC Listen app.
Visit abc.net.au/listen.
Or wherever you grab your app. ABC Listen. Good afternoon, Jamelle Wells with ABC News. Authorities say while COVID numbers in New South Wales are beginning to stabilise, there's still a long way to go with 65 new locally acquired cases. Cecilia Connell reports. Up to 35 of the 65 new locally transmitted cases recorded in the 24 hours to 8 o'clock last night were in the community while infectious. Premier Gladys Berejiklian says that's likely to lead to a spike.
I am predicting we will have higher case numbers tomorrow.
The source of infection for 25 of today's cases remains under investigation. There have now been 929 cases since the current Sydney outbreak began. 58,000 people were tested in the last 24 hours, with facilities boosted around Fairfield in the city's southwest. There are 73 COVID patients in hospital. The ABC understands Melbourne will go into a snap lockdown tonight as authorities race to contain a growing COVID outbreak in that state. Oliver Gordon reports.
Victoria has recorded 2 new COVID cases today, taking the state's total to 16, and there are now 80 exposure sites. Both of today's new cases attended the Carlton Geelong game at the MCG on Saturday. They were seated in the same section as a positive case from the Ariel Apartments at Maribyrnong, but not known to him. The new cases are a man in his 50s and a minor. There are now more than 6,500 Victorians isolated. Masks are mandatory indoors, including at workplaces and secondary schools. It's understood a snap lockdown will come into force tonight, and authorities have described the situation as highly dynamic.
Australia's unemployment rate fell to 4.9% in June, its lowest level in a decade. Here's business reporter David Chow.
We understand that this will come as disappointing news to people in southeast Queensland.
Apologies, that's not the right audio. A coroner has found a man who died while fishing in Tasmania would have survived if he had been wearing a life jacket. Bailey Kenzie reports.
The 66-year-old man drowned after he was swept into the water by a large wave while fishing from elevated rocks above Bolton Beach near Triabunna late last year. Lindy's son was found in the ocean by a rescue helicopter about 300 metres from the scene. A coroner's report found the man would have almost certainly survived had he been wearing a life jacket. The coroner has put forward several recommendations for people fishing in Tasmania, including proper risk assessment of the location, appropriate footwear, and the need to be wearing a buoyancy aid.
The Cuban government is allowing travellers arriving in the country to bring in food, medicine and other essentials without paying import duties. It's being considered as a concession to anti-government protesters. The government says no limit will be placed on these goods, and the change would in effect be until at least the end of next year. A disqualified driver has been charged with failing to stop after a fatal crash in the Riverina. Police say the 52-year-old man failed to stop after 2 cars collided near Griffith yesterday. The 33-year-old man driving the other car died at the scene. The Australian men's cricket team has beaten the West Indies by 4 runs in the 4th T20 International at St Lucia. Mitch Marsh made 75 as Australia set the home team 190 for victory, then took 3 for 24 as the West Indies fell short of the victory target. Marsh recorded his career best T20 figures with bat and ball. West Indies lead the 5-game series 3-1. The AFL has announced 2 more teams will fly to Queensland as a precaution against Victoria's COVID situation. The Swans, GWS and Western Bulldogs departed Melbourne on charter flights this morning. Essendon and North Melbourne are joining them later in the day. The Bombers and Kangaroos will now play their round 18 match this weekend in Queensland. The AFL has flagged further fixture changes in coming weeks. And just recapping, authorities say while COVID numbers in New South Wales are beginning to stabilise, there's still a long way to go with 65 new locally acquired cases. Looking at the weather for New South Wales, showers about the ranges and adjacent western slopes, possible showers elsewhere. Sydney, mostly sunny. Right now, 22 degrees on the coast, 22 in Penrith. The humidity, 49%. Friday, partly cloudy and windy with a top of 19 degrees. Saturday, partly cloudy with a top temperature of 16 degrees forecast. Sunday, fine and sunny with a top temperature of 18 degrees. ABC News. You're listening to James Valentine on ABC Radio.
Yes, you are, and a very good afternoon. I hope all is well and doing as well as you can. If you're in the lockdown area, I hope things are fine if you're out of it. And we'll be talking to Mr. Jonathan Green for a blather in a moment or two, and they've had news the last little while in Melbourne, that's for sure. We're also going to catch up with Kirk Docker. Now, I'm sure you love You Can't Ask That. It's one of the most outstanding things the ABC's produced in recent years, and it's the format where they put people on television, put people in front of camera, and you can write in with questions, and they're the kind of things that you would like to ask, but you're usually not meant to ask of a particular group in society, and it's been spectacularly successful and a great way of talking about all sorts of issues and getting to know a lot of different people in our society in a much better fashion. So season 7 they're up to. It's extraordinary. And look, I'll save this because it is fantastic, but the list of people they're looking for is one of the funniest lists. It came up in my email, if you know anybody in this list, it's like, yeah, that is a very funny gag to be tracking down. So we'll meet Kirk and learn more about that program a little bit later in our time together here on ABC Radio across the state of New South Wales. Well, it's time now for
Jonathan Green and James Valentine. Opinion, comment, blather.
Now, Jonathan Green edits the Angel magazine. He presents Blueprint on RN, which you can find live on Saturdays or otherwise in the podcast and the Listen app and this sort of stuff. And that's most relevant to our conversation this afternoon is that he's resident in Melbourne. So I'm happy to grab him just as he's on his way out to...
Sergio, his son Stephen, known as son of Serge,
Right.
And Stephen's son Jack, known as son of Serge,
Right.
all playing for Carlton in the number 1 Guernsey. Anyway, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
And at moments like these, you take comfort in the rich parade of that sort of tradition of a lost time when people watch their team at the football.
Yeah. And you hope Serge wasn't watching on Saturday. Had he left us by then, or might he have seen?
Well, no, he only left us in the last 24 hours.
Oh, okay.
It's possible he would have been watching the game in some form, and he would have been roundly disappointed.
Do you know what's funny? Jacinta Parsons was on yesterday. We're doing a bit of a link up, and we mentioned the MCG thing, and I said, this is how the conversation around that would have gone. People would have said, there was for the Carlton Geelong game, there was a transmission there. That's now a contact site and that sort of stuff. And people said, that's terrible. I thought Carlton's defence was really poor. But you just pretty much did it there. You just went straight from the
nominations. It was an oversight. Yeah, Nicole Kidman for The Undoing and Joel Edgerton for The Underground Railroad were 2 big, powerful performances of the year. We are represented through Yvonne Strahovski, though, who was nominated once again for The Handmaid.
And for authorities, because a venue like the MCG is not usually a place where we see transmission because it's open air, there's a lot of ventilation, it doesn't usually cause worries for authorities. But these 2 new cases are causing concern. The initial case was a man in his 60s from the Ariel apartment. He's gone there with a friend. That friend tested positive yesterday. And now we know that a case today was sitting in the general vicinity around them, the seats around them, they've tested positive. And then there's also a case that was sitting in the level 2 MCC members reserve, so in that same area but a bit further away again. they've tested positive. So authorities are now saying this really shows how aggressive this Delta strain can be. They're asking everybody who was at the MCG in the level 2 MCC members reserve stand to come forward, get tested, isolate till they get that result. That's our reporter in Melbourne, Jessica Longbottom, speaking to Matthew Doran, and we are standing by to take you to a press conference with the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, at Kirribilli House in Sydney shortly. Situation elsewhere in our region now, and Indonesia has recorded its biggest daily increase yet in coronavirus cases, with more than 54,000 new cases and almost 1,000 deaths. And Malaysia has shut down a mass vaccination centre in its worst hit state after hundreds of medical staff and volunteers tested positive. Southeast Asia correspondent Anne Barker has more. It's become the grim soundtrack to the pandemic in Jakarta. Residents across the capital hear ambulance sirens blaring all day and night, often as volunteer drivers who respond to the emergency calls.
I definitely feel scared about getting infected, and all humans will have such feelings. But this is for humanity, and I'm doing this from my heart.
In full protective gear, 53-year-old Scenario heads out to pick up another COVID-19 patient and take him to a nearby hospital. Ambulance drivers say they can get up to 80 calls a day to transport those infected, but they can only deal with about 30 in the space of 24 hours. Since the latest surge in infections began last month, demand for ambulances has soared. Volunteers are working in addition to government hospital ambulances.
The spike in cases that happened here in Java Island, and mostly in Jakarta, can't be handled by the government alone. Support from the people and volunteers like us is also a must, and we can end the pandemic faster.
The highly contagious Delta variant has seen a surge in patient numbers across Jakarta and much of Java in recent weeks. Indonesia yesterday recorded another 54,000 cases, almost 10 times the caseload in early June. Daily deaths are around 1,000 a day, and health experts predict case numbers will continue to rise as the Delta variant spreads beyond Java and Bali to more and more Indonesian provinces. That's our Southeast Asia correspondent Anne Barker reporting. To other news now, Britney Spears has won the right to choose her own lawyer in her conservatorship trial. The global pop star broke down in tears as she pleaded in an LA court for her father to be removed as her conservator. Ms. Spears gave an explosive testimony last month in which she pleaded with a California judge to allow her to end what she's called an abusive 13-year-long guardianship. BBC's David Lewis.
For the second time in 3 weeks, Britney Spears gave very emotional testimony. She said that her father's control of her affairs was abusive, and she did succeed in getting her own lawyer to represent her after 13 years in which she's been represented by a court-appointed attorney. And that lawyer, Matthew Rosengart, said that he plans to file immediately a motion seeking to have Britney Spears' father, Jamie, stripped of his control over her life. Now, he called Mr. Rosengart in court for Jamie Spears to stand down immediately in the interest of his daughter, and said you claimed that you love your daughter, so that you should step down now from this position. But a lawyer representing Jamie Spears flatly refused to do so. She called some of the accusations levelled against Jamie Spears by his daughter unsubstantiated.
David, if we can just take a sort of a step back as well and remind people and those coming to this perhaps without so much background knowledge why there was this agreement in place under which Britney Spears has had so little control, continues to have so little control over her personal and business affairs.
Well, this conservatorship, it's called a guardianship in some other states, was put in place back in 2008, when you might remember there were some scenes in which Britney Spears appeared to lose control in public. There were clashes with the paparazzi. At one point, of course, she shaved her head. Now, a conservatorship is something that is supposed to be put in place for a very short period of time until somebody